In the cold expanse between stars, where ancient civilizations had carved their names into the fabric of space-time itself, humanity had been forgotten, not destroyed, not conquered, simply overlooked. For 800 years, the galactic confluence, a sprawling federation of 47 species spanning 12,000 worlds, had operated under a simple, unspoken rule. Earth was irrelevant, the third planet from an unremarkable yellow star orbiting in the backwater spiral arm of the Milky Way, housing a species so primitive they had barely escaped their own gravity well when the confluence first catalogued them. The filing clerk who had processed Earth's initial survey report, a methodical Vikingtai named Quetzalthara, had stamped it with classification Theta-9 developing species, no strategic value, monitor every 2 centuries. That stamp had sealed humanity's fate. While the great powers of the galaxy, the crystalline Morden with their planet-sized computational matrices, the energy-based Yilnash, who could manipulate matter at the quantum level, the ancient Zethkal, whose technology bordered on divine carved-up trade routes and negotiated territorial expanses, Earth continued to exist in cosmic isolation. No ambassadors were sent, no trade agreements were offered, no invitations to join the confluence ever arrived. Earth was a footnote. Humans were trivia. Until now, Admiral David Cross stood before the observation deck of the Defiant, humanity's first and only interstellar warship, watching the lights of Nexus Prime grow larger through the reinforced transperisteel. The galactic capital stretched across an entire star system, orbital habitats that gleamed like scattered diamonds, space elevators that pierced the hearts of a dozen worlds, and the central spire itself, a construct so massive it generated its own gravitational field. "Still can't believe they actually invited us," muttered Lieutenant Rebecca Kane from behind him, her fingers dancing across a tactical display. At 28, she was one of the youngest officers ever to serve aboard the Defiant, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, too soon. Cross didn't turn around. He couldn't, because if he did, Rebecca would see the doubt flickering in his weathered features, and doubt was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Not here. Not now. They didn't invite us," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They summoned us." The distinction was important. 3 months ago, a Confluence battlecruiser had appeared in Earth's orbit, the first alien vessel to visit the Sol system in recorded history. No warning, no diplomatic contact. It simply arrived and broadcast a single message across every frequency, in perfect English. "The Confluence Council requires the immediate presence of humanity's representatives at Nexus Prime. Compliance is not optional." The ship had waited exactly 72 hours, then departed, leaving behind coordinates and a timetable that brooked no argument. Now, as Cross watched the alien capital grow before them, he wondered if humanity was about to meet its makers or its executioners. 12 light-years away, on the ocean world of Morden Prime, Engineer Prime Veltash was having what humans might call a very bad day. The Morden were a species that prided itself on order. Their entire civilization was built around predictable patterns, mathematical certainties, and the comforting rhythm of logical progression. For 43,000 years, they had been the galaxy's premier manufacturers, their crystal matrix minds capable of designing technology so advanced that other species often mistook it for magic. But today, Veltash was staring at a series of reports that made absolutely no sense. "Show me the Krivel sector analysis again," Veltash commanded, its voice a harmonic resonance that made the water around its workstation shimmer. The holographic display materialized with crystalline precision, showing trade flow patterns across a region of space encompassing nearly 800 systems. For decades, this sector had followed predictable patterns, raw materials flowing from mining worlds to industrial centers, finished goods moving along established trade routes, currency fluctuations operating within acceptable parameters. But 6 months ago, everything had changed. A new element had entered the equation, something the reports labeled simply as Terran cultural exports. Veltash's primary optical array focused on the data streams, trying to make sense of what it was seeing. In the Krivel sector alone, 17 different species had suddenly begun requesting modifications to their technology, their architecture, even their food production. And every single modification was based on patterns that originated from a single previously ignored world. Earth. Computational matrix, query, define Terran cultural exports. Veltash transmitted. The response came instantly, but it only deepened the mystery, classification pending. Cultural artifacts, entertainment media, philosophical frameworks, and aesthetic preferences originating from Terra Sol 3. Note: current propagation rate exceeds all previous cultural diffusion models by factor of. Veltash's secondary processors began calculating probability matrices, but every simulation yielded the same impossible result. According to every model the Mordin had developed over millennia of galactic observation, Earth should not be capable of cultural influence. Its technology was primitive, its population was small, its political structure was chaotic. And yet, the data streams told a different story. Across 47 member species of the confluence, subtle changes were manifesting. The Yilanash had begun incorporating what they called Terran chaos theory into their energy manipulation techniques. The Zethkelo were experimenting with human storytelling protocols in their ancient archives. Even the proud Vordani war clans had started adopting tactical doctrines they claimed were inspired by Terran military philosophy. But the most disturbing change of all was happening to the Mordin themselves. In the deep water cities of Mordin Prime, young engineers were beginning to question the rigid optimization protocols that had governed their species for millennia. They spoke of something they called creative inefficiency, a concept so alien to Mordin thinking that the Elder Crystals could barely process it, and it was spreading. Engineer Prime Veltash, came a transmission from the Council of Primes. Your presence is required in the Deep Concordance Chamber. Immediate priority. Veltash's form shimmered with uncertainty. In 43,000 years of recorded history, the Council of Primes had never declared an immediate priority session. Something was happening to the galaxy. Something unprecedented. And somehow, impossibly, it all traced back to a small blue world that the confluence had spent 8 centuries ignoring. The Defiant docked at Nexus Prime's primary diplomatic array exactly on schedule, its hull dwarfed by the massive stations that surrounded it like metal moons. As Admiral Cross led his delegation through the airlock, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The reception chamber was a marvel of alien engineering, a vast sphere where artificial gravity oriented itself toward the center, allowing beings from dozens of different worlds to gather without regard for their evolutionary origins. Cross watched in fascination as the Yilnash representatives floated like living aurora above their heads, while the massive Zethkal envoys anchored themselves to the curved walls with gravity manipulators. But it was the silence that disturbed him most. 47 species were represented in this chamber. Beings who had spent millennia engaged in constant negotiation, trade disputes, territorial agreements, and the endless bureaucracy of galactic governance. Yet now, as the human delegation entered, every conversation stopped. Every optical sensor, every sensory array, every form of alien perception in the chamber focused on the dozen humans who stood at the center of the sphere. Admiral Cross of Earth, came a voice that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Cross recognized it from the historical records. Zethkal Prime Speaker Morthek, the eldest entity in known space, whose consciousness spanned over 100,000 years. You stand before the Confluence Council, not as supplicants, not as a developing species seeking guidance, but as. The ancient voice paused, and Cross could swear he heard uncertainty in its harmonics. As a phenomenon that our combined wisdom cannot explain. A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber, showing star charts that Cross immediately recognized. The galaxy, mapped in real time with energy patterns and data flows highlighting the invisible networks that connected worlds to worlds. But something was wrong with the map. Where Earth should have been a tiny, dim point at the edge of the spiral arm, there was instead a blazing node of activity. Streams of data flowed outward from Solis system like rivers of light, touching every corner of known space. The pattern was beautiful, organic, and utterly impossible. Explain this, commanded Vibordani war leader Kethsel, her scarred carapace clicking with agitation. Explain how a species we classified as Theta 9 has somehow become the primary source of cultural influence in the galaxy. Cross looked at the display, then at the assembled aliens. Then back at Rebecca Kane, who was staring at the map with the same expression of bewildered amazement that he felt. Cross began, then stopped. Because the truth was, he had no idea what was happening either. For 800 years, humanity had developed in isolation, building their technology, their culture, their philosophy without any knowledge that they were being watched. They had grown, learned, suffered, and created in complete ignorance of the vast galactic community that surrounded them. But apparently the galaxy had been watching. And somehow something humanity had created, something so fundamentally human that the aliens couldn't even classify it properly, had begun to spread across the stars like wildfire. "We don't know," Cross said finally, his voice carrying in the perfect acoustics of the chamber. "We had no idea any of this was happening." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Kilixthera, the same Vrentai who had originally classified Earth as irrelevant, stepped forward on its 6 spindly legs, its triangular head tilted in what Cross was beginning to recognize as confusion. "Impossible," Kilixthera chittered. "Cultural diffusion requires active propagation. Intent. Purpose. Your species has been under strict and non-contact protocols for 800 standard cycles. No Terran cultural artifacts should have escaped your system, and yet they have," rumbled Engineer Prime Veltash, its crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns. "The evidence is undeniable. Across 12,000 worlds, we are seeing fundamental shifts in behavior, philosophy, and creative expression, all tracing back to patterns that originated on Terra." Rebecca Kane stepped forward, her young face set in the determined expression that Cross had learned to respect. "What kind of patterns?" The holographic display shifted, showing a cascade of images, sounds, and data streams that hurt Cross's eyes to look at directly. Alien architectures that somehow reminded him of human cities. Strange music that carried melodies he could almost recognize. Mathematical equations that felt familiar despite their alien notation. "Art," said Morthak, and there was wonder in the ancient voice. "Stories, songs, games, philosophy, even humor." The last word was spoken as if the prime speaker wasn't entirely certain what it meant. "But how?" Rebecca pressed. "We've never had contact with any of you. We've never sent anything beyond our own solar system except for a few automated probes." "That," said Kaltasara, "is precisely what we intend to find out." The chamber's lighting dimmed and new displays materialized around the human delegation. Cross found himself looking at images of Earth. But not Earth as he knew it. This was Earth from the outside, seen through alien sensors across centuries of observation. "We have been watching your species since you first achieved radio transmission," Morthek explained. "Standard observation protocols for developing civilizations. Monitor technological progress. Assess potential for first contact. Evaluate threat levels." The images shifted, showing humanity's halting progress into space. The first satellites. The lunar landings. The space stations. The gradual expansion that had eventually led to the construction of the Defiant itself. "For 800 years, your development proceeded along predictable parameters," Veltash added. "Technology advancing at expected rates. Population growth within normal bounds. Cultural evolution following standard patterns for carbon-based social species." "Then what changed?" Cross asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. The holographic display zoomed in on Earth, focusing on the sprawling urban centers, the digital networks, the invisible web of communications that connected every human on the planet. 3 years ago, Kilixthera said quietly, "your species achieved what we now believe to be a critical threshold in information density. Your global communication network reached a level of complexity that we underestimated." The display showed patterns of data flow across Earth's surface. The Internet, Cross realized, but visualized in ways that human technology couldn't achieve. He watched in fascination as the streams of information formed intricate patterns almost like neural networks. "Your digital civilization," Morthak continued, "began to emit what we can only describe as cultural radiation. Stories, ideas, creative expressions, philosophical concepts, all encoded in electromagnetic patterns that propagated beyond your atmosphere." Cross felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying our internet signals reached other worlds?" Not directly, Beltash corrected. But they were detected by our long-range monitoring stations. Routine cultural observation protocols required that samples be collected and analyzed. The display shifted again, showing massive alien installations scattered throughout the galaxy. Listening posts, Cross realized. The Confluence had been monitoring dozens of developing civilizations simultaneously, collecting their cultural outputs for analysis and categorization. What we discovered, Trendsetters said, its voice carrying an emotion Cross couldn't identify, was that Terran cultural artifacts possessed properties we had never encountered before. What kind of properties? Rebecca asked. Morthak's ancient consciousness seemed to gather itself before responding. They were infectious. The word hung in the chamber like a curse. Every species that was exposed to Terran cultural samples began to exhibit behavioral modifications. The Prime Speaker continued. Initial exposure resulted in what your own psychology would term curiosity. Subjects wanted to experience more Terran content. They began to incorporate Terran aesthetic principles into their own creations. They started to develop what they described as emotional resonance with Terran narrative structures. Cross felt his heart rate increasing. You experimented on your own people, using our culture as what, some kind of mimetic weapon. It was not intended as a weapon, Beltash protested. We were attempting to understand why Terran cultural artifacts demonstrated such unprecedented propagation potential. The experiments were conducted under controlled conditions, with willing volunteer subjects from each species. And every single one of them was affected, Korvax the Ray added grimly. The chamber fell silent again as the implications sank in. Humanity, isolated and ignorant, had somehow created a form of culture so compelling, so fundamentally appealing to sentient minds that it had infected the entire galaxy. That's impossible, Rebecca said flatly. Culture doesn't work that way. It's not some kind of virus that jumps between species. Isn't it? Mortek asked. Your own history is filled with examples of cultural diffusion. Ideas spreading from one civilization to another, transforming societies, changing the fundamental ways that people think and behave, but not across species barriers, Cross protested. We're talking about beings with completely different evolutionary backgrounds, different neural structures, different ways of processing reality. Yes, agreed Kextera, which is precisely what makes this phenomenon so extraordinary. Terran culture appears to operate at a level beneath conscious thought, beneath species-specific cognition. It speaks to something universal in the nature of consciousness itself. The holographic display changed once more, showing the current state of the galaxy. The streams of cultural influence flowing outward from Earth had grown stronger, brighter, more complex. But now Cross could see something else. Feedback loops. The alien civilizations weren't just passively receiving human culture, they were modifying it, adding their own elements and sending it back into the galactic network. It's not just spreading, Cross whispered. It's evolving. Correct, Morthak confirmed. And that evolution is accelerating beyond our ability to predict or control. The ancient Sethkalil's voice carried a weight of concern that sent shivers down Cross's spine. This was a being that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, that had seen technologies develop from primitive tools to reality-altering forces. If Morthak was concerned about humanity's cultural influence, then the situation was far more serious than Cross had imagined. Some of our member species, Vordani war leader Kethsil growled, are beginning to question whether the current galactic order should continue to exist. The words hit the chamber like a shockwave. Cross saw several alien representatives shift uncomfortably, their various forms of body language all expressing the same emotion. What do you mean? Rebecca asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. I mean, Kegthal said, her scarred carapace clicking with agitation, that after 800 years of stable galactic governance, entire species are beginning to embrace concepts like revolution, independence, and self-determination, concepts that your cultural exports have introduced to minds that never developed them naturally. Cross felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a physical force. Humanity, in its isolation, had unknowingly become a catalyst for galactic revolution. Their stories, their ideas, their fundamental belief in individual freedom and the right to challenge authority had spread across the stars and begun to transform civilizations that had existed in stable hierarchies for millennia. "You're afraid," he said quietly, "that we're going to cause the collapse of the confluence." "We're afraid," Morthak corrected, "that it may already be too late to stop it." The chamber's lighting dimmed further, and Cross noticed that several of the alien representatives were beginning to move toward what he assumed were exit points. The session was ending, but he had the distinct impression that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. "Admiral Cross," Korksthara said, approaching the human delegation with deliberate steps, "your species stands at a crossroads. The Confluence Council has 3 options before it." Cross waited, though he suspected he wasn't going to like any of them. Option 1. We implement immediate containment protocols. Earth is isolated completely. No signals in or out. No contact with any confluence species. No cultural exchanges of any kind. Your species continues to develop in complete isolation until we can find a way to neutralize the mimetic effects of your cultural exports. Option 2, Veltash continued. We attempt integration. Humanity is granted full membership in the confluence, with the understanding that your cultural influence will be carefully monitored and, where necessary, regulated. Rebecca stepped forward. And option 3? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Kefsil provided the words anyway. Option 3 is that the Confluence Council declares humanity a clear and present danger to galactic stability and takes appropriate action to eliminate the threat. Cross felt his blood turn to ice. After 800 years of isolation, humanity's first contact with galactic civilization was potentially going to be a war for survival. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The Council reconvenes in 72 hours, Morthak replied. "You will have until then to prepare your species' response to these options." "But Admiral," the ancient consciousness paused, and when it spoke again there was something almost like sympathy in its voice. "I should warn you that the debate over option 3 has already begun." As the alien representatives began to file out of the chamber, Cross found himself staring at the holographic display of the galaxy, watching the streams of human cultural influence pulse like arteries carrying lifeblood to every corner of known space. Humanity had spent 8 centuries dreaming of the day they would join a galactic community. They had never imagined that their inclusion might require a war to defend their right to exist. The emergency session of Earth's Planetary Defense Council convened 18 hours after the Defiant's return, in a bunker buried 3 kilometers beneath the Rockies. President Sarah Morrison sat at the head of a table surrounded by the finest military and scientific minds humanity had to offer, staring at a holographic projection that showed their entire solar system bristling with alien sensor arrays. "They've been watching us for 800 years, Admiral Cross reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "Every transmission, every cultural artifact, every story we've ever told. And somehow, those stories have begun to reshape the galaxy." Dr. James Chen, Earth's foremost xenopsychologist, leaned forward with barely contained excitement. "The implications are staggering. We're looking at the first documented case of trans-species mimetic propagation. Our cultural expressions have somehow found universal resonance points in alien consciousness. The problem," Lieutenant Kane interjected grimly, "is that some of those aliens want to kill us for it." The holographic display shifted to show the current deployment of Confluence fleet assets. Cross watched President Morrison's face pale as the tactical projections became clear. Arrayed around the Sol system were enough warships to reduce Earth to cosmic dust within hours. "Options?" Morrison asked quietly. General Patricia Rodriguez, head of planetary defense, spoke first. "From a military standpoint, we're completely outmatched. Our most advanced weapons are roughly equivalent to what they had 10,000 years ago. If this comes to a shooting war, we lose. Period." "What about option 1? Morrison pressed. "Isolation. Would that satisfy them?" Dr. Chen shook his head. "Based on Admiral Cross's report, the cultural contamination has already spread too far. Isolating us now would be like trying to contain a pandemic after it's already gone global. The mimetic effects are self-propagating. Which brings us to option 2, Cross said. Integration under their terms." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated what that might mean. humanity joining the confluence, but as a junior partner whose every cultural expression would be monitored and regulated by alien overseers. There's a fourth option, came a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Dr. Lisa Park, a theoretical physicist who had been working on humanity's first attempts at faster-than-light communication. She stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had just solved an impossible equation. "What if we're approaching this backwards?" she said. "The confluence sees our cultural influence as a threat because it's destabilizing their established order. But what if that's not a bug? What if it's a feature?" President Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Park activated her own holographic display, showing the galaxy-wide pattern of cultural diffusion that the aliens had revealed. But her visualization highlighted something different. The feedback loops. The places where human culture was being modified and enhanced by alien perspectives. "Look at these patterns," she said excitedly. "This isn't just human culture spreading outward. It's a genuine exchange. Our stories are inspiring alien creativity, but their responses are inspiring new human innovations. We're seeing the birth of the first truly galactic culture. And why should that matter to the confluence?" Rodriguez asked skeptically. "Because," Perk replied, "according to every model I've run, this kind of cultural synthesis produces exponential advances in technological and social development. The confluence has been stable for thousands of years, which means they've also been stagnant. We might represent the evolutionary catalyst they need to take the next step." Cross studied the data flows on Park's display. "You're suggesting we convince them that our cultural influence isn't a threat, it's an opportunity." "I'm suggesting," Park said, "that we show them what humanity does best: adapt, improvise, and turn impossible situations into victories." 12 light-years away, Engineer Prime Veltash was experiencing something unprecedented in Mordan history. Doubt, the crystalline being floated in the deep concordance chamber, surrounded by the collective wisdom of its species, thousands of interconnected crystal matrices that had solved every engineering challenge the galaxy had ever presented. But now, faced with the human phenomenon, the greatest minds of the Mordun were confused. Computational Matrix 17 reports a 73% increase in creative innovation among our junior engineers, announced Crystal Mind Kilathril. They are developing solutions that exceed optimal efficiency parameters, while simultaneously improving functionality. "That should be impossible," Veltash responded. "Optimization is a mathematical absolute. You cannot exceed optimal efficiency." "And yet," Cathral continued, "the evidence is undeniable. Engineers exposed to Terran cultural samples are producing designs that our primary algorithms classify as impossible but functional." Veltash accessed the design files directly, letting the data flow through its consciousness like a stream of liquid mathematics. What it found there challenged every assumption the Mordun had developed about the nature of engineering. The young engineers weren't just solving problems, they were asking new questions. Questions that had never occurred to minds trained in perfect logical optimization. They were introducing variables like aesthetic pleasure and user emotional response into equations that had previously focused solely on mathematical efficiency. And somehow those additions were making the designs better. "Show me the Zethikal cultural analysis reports," Veltash commanded. The data streams shifted, revealing intelligence gathered from the galaxy's oldest civilization. The Zethkal had been the first to achieve true galactic consciousness, their individual minds merging into collective entities that spanned thousands of years. They were considered the ultimate authorities on cultural development and social evolution. But even they were struggling to understand the human phenomenon. Prime Speaker Morthic has issued 17 separate analyses of Terran cultural artifacts, Kethril reported. Each analysis contradicts the previous conclusions. Veltash found this deeply disturbing. The Zethkalar were not known for uncertainty. Their ancient minds had observed the rise and fall of hundreds of civilizations, identifying patterns that allowed them to predict cultural development with near-perfect accuracy. What is the nature of the contradictions? Initial analysis classified Terran culture as primitive but energetic, Clethril explained. Subsequent studies have progressively upgraded this classification to complex but chaotic, then sophisticated but unpredictable, and most recently fundamentally paradigm-shifting. The implications were staggering. If even the Zathkal couldn't categorize human culture using their existing frameworks, then humanity represented something genuinely new in the galaxy's history. What does Prime Speaker Morthek conclude? The Prime Speaker has stopped issuing conclusions, Quathral replied. Latest communication indicates that the Zathkal collective consciousness is evolving in response to Terran cultural exposure. Veltash's crystal matrix flickered with what humans might recognize as alarm. The Zathkal had achieved perfect mental stability over 100,000 years ago. They didn't evolve anymore. They had transcended the need for change. Define evolving, Veltash requested, though it suspected the answer would be disturbing. Individual Zathkal entities are beginning to separate from the collective consciousness. They are pursuing what they call personal narrative arcs and expressing preferences. The word hung in the data stream like a discordant note. The Zathkatel didn't have preferences. They had optimal solutions to all possible scenarios. Preferences implied individuality, subjectivity, the kind of inefficient emotional processing that advanced civilizations had long since eliminated. This is catastrophic, Veltash concluded. If the Zathkal are fragmenting, then the stability of the entire confluence is at risk. Agreed, Quathral responded, which is why the War Council has been convened. Veltash's optical arrays dimmed with what could only be described as dread. The War Council had not been activated in over 3,000 years. It represented the confluence's ultimate response to existential threats. A council empowered to make decisions that superseded all normal diplomatic protocols, including the authorization of species extinction. Who leads the War Council? Veltash asked, though it already knew the answer. Vordani war leader Kethsil has been granted emergency command authority, Kethshral confirmed. The human question will be resolved within the next Galactic Standard Day. Veltash processed this information with growing unease. The Vordani were the confluence's primary military force, a warrior species that had evolved on a world where violence was the only path to survival. They understood strength, territory, and elimination of threats. They did not understand subtlety, cultural complexity, or the possibility that some problems might require solutions other than warfare. Has anyone attempted to communicate these findings to the War Council? Veltash inquired. Engineer Prime, Quathral said carefully. The War Council has classified all research into Terran cultural effects as potential contamination vectors. Any being who has been exposed to human cultural artifacts is prohibited from participating in the decision-making process. The full scope of the catastrophe became clear to Veltash in that moment. The only beings qualified to understand the human phenomenon were the ones who had been affected by it, and therefore the ones who were forbidden from influencing the confluence's response. The War Council was about to make a decision about humanity based on incomplete, possibly completely incorrect information. This is not logical, Veltash stated. Logic, Quathral replied, may no longer be sufficient to address this situation. On the warship Blade of Dominion, war leader Kethsil stood before a tactical display showing the Sol system in exquisite detail. Every human settlement, every orbital installation, every defensive position had been mapped and analyzed. The extinction of humanity would require approximately 4 hours of coordinated bombardment. It would be, from a military perspective, a very straightforward operation. Tactical assessment complete, reported Submender Treshka, his scarred carapace bearing the ritual scars of a dozen conquered worlds. Human defensive capabilities are negligible. Total elimination can be achieved with minimal resource expenditure. Callus Sul nodded, her predatory gaze fixed on the small blue world that had somehow become the center of galactic concern. The Vordani understood simple solutions to complex problems. Humanity represented a threat to galactic stability. Therefore, humanity needed to be eliminated. It was basic military doctrine, refined across millennia of warfare. But something nagged at the edges of Cathasil's consciousness, something that had been growing stronger ever since she had been exposed to the human cultural samples during the preliminary threat assessment. Sub-Commander, she said slowly, what is your personal evaluation of the Terran cultural artifacts? Threshka's mandibles clicked in confusion. Personal evaluation, war leader. I am uncertain what you mean. Cathil studied her subordinate carefully. Threshka was a perfect example of Vordani military conditioning, efficient, ruthless, and completely focused on tactical objectives. He was also, she realized, one of the few beings in her command who had not been exposed to human culture. "Have you reviewed any of the Terran creative works?" she asked. "Their stories, their music, their entertainment." Negative, war leader. Command protocol prohibits exposure to potential contamination vectors. Cathil felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she couldn't quite identify. 6 months ago, she would have agreed completely with Threshka's response. Cultural exposure was a weakness, a distraction from military effectiveness. But 6 months ago, she hadn't experienced what humans called Star Wars. The human story cycle had been included in the cultural samples as an example of their primitive entertainment. Cathil had studied it as part of her threat assessment, expecting to find evidence of human aggression, territorial ambition, or military doctrine. Instead, she had found something that challenged every assumption she had developed about the nature of conflict itself. "Sub-Commander," she said carefully, "what is the primary objective of Vordani military doctrine?" "Victory through superior force," Threshka replied immediately. "Total domination of enemies. Establishment of territorial control. And what happens after victory is achieved?" Threshka's confusion deepened. "After victory, war leader. Victory is the completion of the objective." Cathil turned away from the tactical display, her thoughts churning with concepts that had no place in traditional Vordani thinking. The human story cycle had shown her something unprecedented. Warriors who fought not for domination but for protection of others. Soldiers who sacrificed themselves not for territory, but for abstract concepts like freedom and hope. It was, by Vordani standards, completely illogical. It was also, she was beginning to suspect, the most powerful military philosophy she had ever encountered. "Threshka," she said quietly, "have you ever considered the possibility that our military doctrine might be incomplete?" The sub-commander's carapace stiffened with alarm. "War leader, are you experiencing contamination effects? Perhaps you should submit to purification protocols." "No," Cathil said firmly. "I am experiencing what humans call character development." She turned back to the tactical display, but now, instead of seeing a target for elimination, she saw something else. Earth wasn't just a world full of potential enemies. It was a world full of beings who had developed something the galaxy had never seen before. They had created stories that could change minds across species barriers. They had developed philosophies that made warriors question the nature of warfare itself. They had built a culture so compelling that exposure to it triggered evolution in the galaxy's oldest and most stable civilizations. "Sub-Commander," she said, "I want you to review the complete tactical assessment of human military history." "War leader, humans have never engaged in interstellar warfare. Their military capabilities are primitive by confluence standards." "I'm not interested in their capabilities," Cathil replied. "I'm interested in their strategies." As Threshka began accessing the human military databases, Cathil found herself thinking about a particular scene from the human story cycle. A moment where a young warrior faced with impossible odds and certain death chose to trust in hope rather than rely on superior firepower. And somehow, impossibly, hope had been enough. The War Council was scheduled to begin in 6 hours. By galactic law, Cathil was required to present her recommendation for dealing with the human threat. The logical choice was clear: extinction. But for the first time in her military career, Cathil was beginning to suspect that logic might not be the only consideration that mattered. The emergency session of the Confluence War Council convened aboard the massive space station. Final arbitration, positioned at the exact gravitational center of the Nexus Prime system. Representatives from every major military power in the galaxy gathered in a chamber designed for decisions that would reshape the cosmic order. War leader Cathil stood before the assembled council, acutely aware that the next few hours would determine the fate of not just humanity, but potentially the entire galactic civilization. "The council recognizes war leader Cathil of the Vordani hegemony," announced Supreme Admiral Ithkara of the Nexus Defense Force. "Present your tactical assessment of the Terran threat." Cathil activated the holographic display showing the Sol system in perfect tactical detail, Every human installation, every defensive position, every potential point of resistance was highlighted in stark military precision. The human species represents an unprecedented mimetic threat to galactic stability, she began, following the script that had been prepared by the Confluence Intelligence Services. Their cultural artifacts have demonstrated the ability to trigger behavioral modifications across all exposed species. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The military leaders of the galaxy understood threats, and humanity clearly represented something dangerous. Current contamination levels indicate that 17 member species have been significantly affected by Terran cultural exposure. Council continued. Projected contamination curves suggest total galactic saturation within 50 standard years if current trends continue. Recommendation? Demanded Admiral Vexithal of the Crystalline Armada. Kitsil paused, staring at the tactical display. According to every military manual, every strategic doctrine, every rational analysis, there was only one possible response to an existential threat of this magnitude. Total extinction, she said quietly. Complete elimination of all human settlements. Sterilization of the Sol system to prevent any possibility of cultural artifact recovery. The chamber erupted in approving growls, clicks, and harmonic resonances. The military leaders of the galaxy had reached the conclusion they expected, the conclusion that made sense according to every precedent in their shared history. But Kathsil wasn't finished. However, she said, and the word cut through the chamber's noise like a blade, I must also present an alternative analysis. Supreme Admiral Youth Tukara's optical arrays focused on her with laser intensity. Alternative analysis. Kethsal took what humans might recognize as a deep breath. During the course of my investigation, I was exposed to extensive samples of Terran cultural artifacts. This exposure has provided me with insights that pure tactical analysis cannot achieve. A chorus of alarm sounds filled the chamber. Several representatives began moving toward exits, clearly concerned about mimetic contamination. War Leader Kethsil, Yakara said coldly, you are in violation of contamination protocols. Your analysis is compromised. Yes, Kethsil agreed. It is, and that compromise has revealed something that our traditional analysis completely missed. She modified the holographic display, showing not just human military installations, but the pattern of cultural influence spreading across the galaxy. But this time she highlighted something different, the improvements, the innovations, the advances that were occurring in every civilization touched by human culture. The more done have achieved a 23% increase in engineering efficiency while simultaneously improving user satisfaction, she reported. The Yulanash have developed new energy manipulation techniques that were considered theoretically impossible 6 months ago. Even the Zethkol are experiencing cognitive evolution after 100,000 years of perfect stasis. Contamination effects, Admiral Vexthal declared. Proof that the threat must be eliminated. Or, Kathsil said, proof that what we're witnessing is not contamination but evolution. She changed the display again, showing the historical development of galactic civilization over the past 10,000 years. The progression was clear. Initial expansion, technological advancement, the formation of the confluence, and then stagnation. For 3,000 years, Kethesel continued, galactic civilization has been essentially static. We have achieved stability, but at the cost of growth. We have eliminated conflict, but also eliminated the driving forces that create innovation and progress. Stability is the foundation of civilization, Ithkara protested. It is the highest achievement of any species. Is it? Kathsil asked. Or is it simply another word for stagnation? She brought up the final display, a projection showing 2 possible futures for galactic civilization. In the first, humanity was eliminated. The contamination was contained and the galaxy returned to its previous state of stable mediocrity. In the second, human cultural influence continued to spread, triggering unpredictable but potentially revolutionary changes across all member species. The choice before us, Kathasal said, is not between safety and danger. It is between stagnation and evolution. Between the preservation of what we have built and the possibility of becoming something greater than we ever imagined. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Military leaders who had spent their entire careers focused on threat elimination we're being asked to consider the possibility that this particular threat might also be an opportunity. You are asking us, Supreme Admiral Lithkara said slowly, to gamble the stability of galactic civilization on the hope that human cultural influence will prove beneficial rather than destructive. I am asking you, Kethsil replied, to consider what humanity has already taught us. That sometimes the greatest victories come not from eliminating our enemies but from transforming them into allies. Admiral Vexthadal's crystalline form refracted the chamber's light into sharp patterns. And if you are wrong? If this cultural contamination leads to the collapse of everything we have built? Kethsil met the alien admiral's gaze with steady resolve. Then we will face that challenge the way humans have taught us to face all challenges. Together, with hope and with the determination to build something better from whatever remains. The War Council was scheduled to reach its decision within the hour. But for the first time in the recorded history of galactic civilization, a military assembly was being asked to choose evolution over elimination. As the debate began, Kethsil found herself thinking about another scene from the human story cycle, a moment where an ancient warrior, faced with the choice between perpetuating an endless cycle of violence or breaking free into something new, chose to save the very enemy who had sought to destroy him. It was, by any rational military analysis, the worst possible tactical decision. It was also, she was beginning to understand, exactly the kind of impossible choice that separated true leadership from mere command. The vote was called. And across the galaxy, the future hung in the balance. The communication from the War Council reached Earth exactly 73 hours after the Defiant had first docked at Nexus Prime. Admiral Cross stood in the same bunker conference room where humanity's leaders had gathered to plan their defense, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The Confluence War Council, he announced to the assembled officials, has reached a decision. President Morrison leaned forward, her face pale with exhaustion from 3 days of around-the-clock strategic planning. What's the verdict? Cross activated the holographic display, showing the official seal of the Galactic Confluence above a document written in 47 different alien languages, with a human translation scrolling beneath. Option 4, he said quietly. Dr. Chen blinked in confusion. Option 4. They only gave us 3 choices. Apparently, Cross replied. We inspired them to think of a 4th. He began reading from the official declaration. The Confluence War Council hereby establishes the Terra Integration Protocol, recognizing humanity as a species of unprecedented cultural significance. Rather than containment, isolation, or elimination, the Council authorizes the implementation of Project Genesis. What the hell is Project Genesis? General Rodriguez demanded. Cross smiled. The first genuine smile he had managed in 3 days. They're offering us a partnership, not as junior members of the Confluence, but as cultural consultants for the entire galaxy. The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Park's incredulous laughter. They want to hire us? To do what we've been doing accidentally? More than that, Cross continued, scrolling through the documentation. They're proposing the establishment of cultural exchange centers on 200 worlds throughout the galaxy. Facilities where humans and aliens can collaborate on what they're calling guided cultural evolution. And the catch? Morrison asked. Because there was always a catch. We have to do it willingly, Cross replied. Full partnership means full responsibility. If this experiment fails, if human cultural influence destabilizes the galaxy, then humanity accepts full accountability for the consequences. Dr. Chen was studying the terms of the agreement with obvious fascination. This is unprecedented. They're essentially asking us to become the galaxy's therapists, helping entire civilizations work through thousands of years of cultural stagnation. The question is, Morrison said, are we ready for that kind of responsibility? Before anyone could answer, Lieutenant Kane stepped forward with a datapad showing real-time communications from across the galaxy. Madam President, I think you should see this. The holographic display shifted to show message streams flooding in from hundreds of worlds. Alien civilizations who had been exposed to human culture were sending communications directly to Earth. Not through official Confluence channels, but via jury-rigged transmission arrays that shouldn't have been capable of interstellar communication. How are they managing to reach us? Rodriguez asked. Kane's eyes lit up with amazement. They're using techniques derived from human science fiction. Stories about faster-than-light communication gave them ideas for modifying their existing technology in ways their engineers never considered. Cross began reading some of the messages aloud. To our human friends, the concept of chosen family has revolutionized Yulnash social structures. We wish to learn more about this found family phenomenon. From the engineering core of Morden Prime, human punk rock music has inspired 17 breakthrough innovations in crystal matrix harmonics. Request immediate cultural exchange. Zethkal Collective Fragment 7842 to Earth. We have discovered individual consciousness. It is terrifying and wonderful. Please send more stories about personal growth. The messages kept coming. Thousands of them from species humanity had never heard of, all asking for the same thing: more human culture, more stories, more of whatever indefinable quality had managed to break through millions of years of cultural inertia. They're not waiting for official approval, Morrison realized. These civilizations are bypassing the confluence entirely, which means, Dr. Park added with growing excitement, that even if we rejected the Council's offer, it wouldn't matter. The cultural exchange is already happening whether the governments want it or not. Cross felt a familiar chill run down his spine. We've started something we can't stop. No, came a new voice from the chamber's communication system. You've started something we can't stop. Everyone turned toward the speakers as an alien voice filled the room, harmonics that could only belong to a Zethkal collective consciousness. This is Prime Speaker Morthak, the voice continued. I am communicating directly from Nexus Prime to request immediate personal dialogue with human representatives. Morrison exchanged glances with Cross. Direct communication from the galaxy's most ancient entity was unprecedented. This is President Morrison of Earth, she replied. What can we do for you, Prime Speaker? You can explain, Morthak said, why your species appears to be immune to your own cultural influence. The question hung in the air like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Cross felt his mind racing as he tried to understand what the alien entity was asking. I'm not sure what you mean, Morrison said carefully. Every species exposed to human cultural artifacts experiences significant behavioral modifications, Morthak explained. Yet humans themselves appear unchanged by this exposure. You continue to function according to your established psychological and social patterns despite constant immersion in your own cultural products. Dr. Chen leaned forward with sudden understanding. You're asking why we don't get affected by our own stories the way you do. Precisely. This immunity suggests either that humans have developed natural resistance to mimetic influence, or that your cultural artifacts operate through mechanisms that do not affect their creators. Cross felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Prime Speaker, how long have you been studying human psychology? The Zethkal Collective has observed your species for 800 standard cycles. We have detailed psychological profiles for your entire civilization. And in all that time, Cross continued, what was the one thing about humanity that confused you the most? Morthak's response came without hesitation. Your species' ability to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming evidence that such hope is irrational. The conference room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. Cross looked around at his colleagues, Dr. Chen with his excited fascination for alien psychology, Lieutenant Kane with her determined optimism despite impossible odds, Dr. Park with her unshakable belief that any problem could be solved with enough creativity. Prime Speaker, he said slowly, I think what you're seeing isn't immunity to our own culture. I think what you're seeing is that hope itself is the actual cultural artifact. Explain. Cross activated the holographic display, showing the pattern of human cultural influence across the galaxy. But this time he highlighted something different. Not the stories themselves, but the underlying message that ran through all of them. Every human story, regardless of genre or medium, contains the same basic premise, he said. That individuals have the power to change their circumstances. That the future can be better than the past. That problems can be solved, challenges can be overcome, and growth is always possible. Hope, Dr. Chen added with growing excitement, is the most fundamentally human characteristic. It's what allowed us to survive as a species, what drove us to explore beyond our world, what made us keep trying even when we thought we were alone in the universe. And you're immune to it, Morrison realized, because you've been living it your entire lives. Morthek's voice carried what could only be described as wonder. Your species has developed a form of consciousness that naturally generates the very phenomenon that we find so transformative. Which means, Lieutenant Kane said with a grin that Cross was beginning to recognize as dangerous, that the real question isn't whether humanity is ready to help the galaxy evolve. The question is whether the galaxy is ready for what humanity has to offer. 3 months later, the Cultural Exchange Center orbiting Nexus Prime had become the most active facility in known space. Representatives from 84 different species had requested admission to what the galactic media was calling the human experience. Dr. Lisa Park stood in the center of the main conference hall, surrounded by a collection of beings that would have been considered impossible just a year earlier. Crystalline Mordan engineers worked alongside energy-based Yilnash philosophers, while ancient Zethkal entities engaged in heated debates with young Vordani warriors who had abandoned their military posts to pursue what they called personal narrative development. The key, Park was explaining to a mixed group of alien anthropologists, is that human culture doesn't just tell stories about change, it assumes that change is inevitable, natural, and ultimately beneficial. A recently fragmented Zethkalile entity raised one of its tentacular appendages. But how do you maintain stability in the face of constant change? Park smiled, recognizing the question that lay at the heart of the galactic transformation. We don't. We've learned to find stability not in maintaining static conditions, but in our ability to adapt to whatever comes next. Across the hall, Admiral Cross was leading what had become known as Hope Workshops, sessions where alien military leaders learned human concepts of strategic thinking based on possibility rather than probability. The human approach to impossible odds, he was explaining to a group of Confluence naval officers, is to ask not how can we avoid losing, but how can we turn this situation into a victory. War leader Kethso, who had become the most vocal advocate for the Terra Integration Protocol, nodded enthusiastically. This reframes defeat as a temporary setback rather than a final outcome. Exactly, Cross agreed. And once you start thinking in terms of temporary setbacks rather than permanent defeats, the range of available strategies expands exponentially. But perhaps the most popular area of the Cultural Exchange Center was what had been designated the Story Laboratory. Here, beings from across the galaxy were collaborating on new forms of narrative that combined human storytelling techniques with alien perspectives and experiences. Lieutenant Rebecca Kane had found herself in charge of this section, despite having no formal background in creative writing. But she had discovered that her military training and tactical analysis translated surprisingly well to narrative structure. Remember, she was telling a group of aspiring alien storytellers, every good story is fundamentally about someone facing a challenge and finding a way to grow stronger because of it. The specific details, technology level, species characteristics, planetary environments, those are just the background. The heart of the story is always the growth. A young Mordan engineer raised one of its crystal appendages. But what if the protagonist fails to overcome the challenge? Kane grinned. Then you tell the story of how that failure becomes the foundation for someone else's success. In human storytelling, there's no such thing as a meaningless defeat. Every failure teaches someone something that leads to eventual victory. The alien beings in the workshop exchanged what Kane was learning to recognize as expressions of amazement across species barriers. The concept that failure could be meaningful, that defeat could serve a purpose in a larger narrative, was apparently revolutionary to civilizations that had spent millennia trying to eliminate all possibility of loss. On the other side of the galaxy, Engineer Prime Veltash floated in its crystal matrix workstation, reviewing the latest reports from the Cultural Exchange Centers. The data was unprecedented, challenging, and utterly fascinating. Productivity across Mordan civilization had increased by 347% in the 3 months since the Terra Integration Protocol had been implemented. But more importantly, job satisfaction, a concept that hadn't existed in Mordan vocabulary 6 months earlier, had become a measurable factor in engineering efficiency. Status report on Project Synthesis, Veltash requested from the collective databank. The response materialized as streams of interconnected information. 47,000 confluent species have initiated cultural exchange protocols with human representatives. Innovation rates have increased by an average of 290% across all participating civilizations. Social stability indices show. The stream paused. Classification uncertain. Recommend new terminology. Veltash found this particularly intriguing. The Mordaunt databanks contained precise definitions for every form of social organization that had been observed across the galaxy's history. If they couldn't classify what was happening to galactic civilization, then something genuinely unprecedented was taking place. Define current social stability status, Veltash commanded. Social structures are experiencing rapid reorganization, but populations report increased satisfaction with existential parameters. Rebellion rates have increased by 1,020 to 47%, but violent conflict has decreased by 87%. Recommend classification, constructive instability. Veltash processed this paradox with growing amazement. Across the galaxy, species were overthrowing established power structures, challenging ancient hierarchies, and completely restructuring their civilizations. By every traditional measure, this should have led to chaos, violence, and societal collapse. Instead, it was leading to what the humans called personal empowerment and collective growth. How are humans managing widespread social transformation without corresponding increases in destructive conflict? Veltash inquired. The databank's response was immediate. Analysis indicates human cultural frameworks include embedded conflict resolution protocols. Stories consistently demonstrate that cooperation produces superior outcomes to competition. Narrative structures promote individual development, while maintaining social cohesion. Veltash contemplated this information with something approaching what humans might recognize as awe. Humanity had somehow developed a form of culture that could trigger massive social change while simultaneously providing the tools necessary to manage that change constructively. They weren't just storytellers or philosophers or cultural innovators. They were social engineers who had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued galactic civilization for millennia: how to achieve progress without sacrificing stability. Open communication channel to Cultural Exchange Center Nexus Prime, Veltash commanded. Priority maximum. The channel opened, revealing Dr. Park's image in the holographic display. She was surrounded by alien beings engaged in animated discussion. But she turned to address Veltash with the easy confidence that humans seem to bring to every impossible situation. "Engineer Prime Veltash," she said with a smile. "What can we do for you?" "Dr. Park, our analysis suggests that human cultural integration has solved what we term the development paradox. The historical observation that civilizations can either maintain stability or pursue growth, but not both simultaneously." "That's right," Park agreed. "We call it sustainable progress. The idea that you can keep moving forward without leaving anyone behind." "How?" Veltash asked simply. Park's smile widened. "By changing what you consider to be the definition of progress. Most civilizations measure advancement by what they can build, conquer, or accumulate. We measure it by how many beings we can help become the best versions of themselves." Veltash felt its crystal matrix resonate with harmonics it had never experienced before. "You measure progress by potential rather than achievement." "Exactly. Because achievement is finite. There's only so much territory to conquer, only so many resources to gather. But potential is infinite. Every being in the galaxy can grow, learn, and become something greater than they were before." As the communication ended, Veltash found itself contemplating the implications of humanity's approach to civilization. For the first time in its species' history, it was considering the possibility that the Mordaunt obsession with optimization might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps true optimization wasn't about creating the most efficient system possible. Perhaps it was about creating systems that could help every individual within them become more than they ever imagined they could be. It was a revolutionary thought for a civilization built on mathematical certainties. But then again, revolution was exactly what humanity was teaching the galaxy to embrace. The final session of the first Galactic Cultural Symposium convened aboard a massive space construct that had been built specifically for the occasion. Representatives from over 2,000 species gathered in a hall that defied conventional understanding of architecture. A space where artificial gravity, atmospheric controls, and sensory interfaces had been designed to accommodate every known form of sentient life. Admiral Cross stood at the center of the assembly, looking out at a collection of beings that represented the most diverse gathering in galactic history. 6 months ago, Many of these species had barely acknowledged each other's existence. Now they were collaborating on projects that were reshaping the fundamental nature of civilization itself. 6 months ago, he began, his voice carried by translation systems that rendered his words into thousands of different communication methods. Humanity received an ultimatum: prove that our cultural influence was beneficial to galactic civilization or face extinction. A chorus of sounds, clicks, harmonics, and other alien expressions that all meant the same thing rippled through the assembly. The gathered beings were laughing. Today, Cross continued, we're here to evaluate not just whether human culture has been beneficial, but whether the galaxy is prepared for the next phase of our shared evolution. The holographic displays throughout the hall activated, showing real-time data from across the galaxy. The statistics were staggering. Innovation rates that exceeded all historical records. Population satisfaction indices that had required the invention of new mathematical models, and most remarkably, conflict resolution success rates approaching 9. The Terry integration protocol has exceeded all projected outcomes, announced Prime Speaker Morthek, its ancient voice carrying new harmonics that suggested the fundamental transformation of Zethkal consciousness was continuing. But our analysis indicates that we have only begun to explore the potential applications of human cultural principles. War leader Keth Sill stepped forward, her scarred carapace now decorated with what she called hope symbols, markings inspired by human artistic traditions. The Vordani hegemony formally requests expansion of the cultural exchange program to include combat integration protocols. Cross raised an eyebrow. Combat integration. We wish to learn how human military philosophy can be applied to conflicts beyond warfare, Cathiel explained. Conflicts with poverty, disease, environmental degradation, resource scarcity. We believe human strategic thinking could revolutionize our approach to these challenges. Engineer Prime Veltash's crystalline form projected into the hall through quantum entanglement. The Mordun Collective concurs. Human optimization principles have transformed our understanding of efficiency itself. We request collaboration on what we term empathetic engineering technology design that prioritizes user emotional well-being alongside functional performance. As representative after representative stood to announce new collaboration proposals, Cross felt a familiar mixture of pride and terror. Humanity had somehow managed to avoid extinction by becoming exactly what the galaxy needed. But the responsibility that came with that role was staggering. Dr. Park, he said, turning to his colleague who had become the galaxy's foremost expert on sustainable cultural evolution, do you want to address the Assembly's proposals? Park stepped forward with the same determined smile she had worn during the darkest moments of Earth's crisis. 6 months ago, we thought we were facing the end of human civilization. What we were actually facing was the beginning of something unprecedented. The first truly galactic culture. She activated a new holographic display showing projected development curves for the next century. The models were complex, multidimensional, and beautiful, depicting a future where thousands of species could maintain their individual identities while participating in a shared framework of growth and cooperation. But here's the thing about human culture, Park continued. We don't just tell stories about heroes who save the day. We tell stories about ordinary people who discover they're capable of extraordinary things. And that's not just entertainment. That's a blueprint for reality. She gestured toward the assembled representatives, beings who represented the most advanced civilizations in galactic history. Every one of you has spent the last 6 months proving that story true. You've discovered capabilities you didn't know you had, found solutions to problems you thought were impossible, and built connections across species barriers that your ancestors considered insurmountable. The hall fell silent as the implications of her words settled in. Humanity hadn't just influenced galactic culture. They had revealed that galactic culture had always had unlimited potential that simply needed the right catalyst to unlock it. So the question now, Park concluded, isn't whether we're ready for the next phase of galactic evolution. The question is, what story do we want to tell about what comes next? The answer to that question came from an unexpected source. A young Yelnash entity, barely past the equivalent of adolescence in its species development, manifested in the center of the hall. Its energy form pulsed with colors that had no names in any galactic language, but somehow conveyed a sense of boundless possibility. "I am Zenthira," it announced, its voice carried by modulated electromagnetic frequencies. "6 months ago, I was destined to follow the traditional Ilnash path: energy manipulation, cosmic contemplation, gradual merger with the collective consciousness." The assembly listened with rapt attention as Zenthira continued. But exposure to human cultural artifacts revealed an alternative: individual growth as a path to collective enrichment. "I have chosen to remain individual, to pursue what humans call personal development, while contributing my unique perspective to the greater whole." "This should not be possible," murmured an elder Yilnash representative. "Individual consciousness cannot be maintained beyond the integration phase." According to traditional Yilnash doctrine, Zenthira agreed. "But human stories taught me that traditions can evolve. They showed me that impossible is often just another word for unprecedented." The young entity's energy form shifted, displaying patterns that combined traditional Yulnash harmonic structures with something entirely new, frequencies that seemed to pulse with what humans would recognize as determination, hope, and joy. "I propose," Zenthira announced, "the creation of the Galactic Council of Individual Voices, a governing body where every sapient being can contribute their unique perspective to decisions that affect our shared future." The proposal sent shockwaves through the assembly. Traditional galactic governance was based on species-level representation, with individual consciousness considered too chaotic and unpredictable for effective decision-making. "The logistics alone would be overwhelming," protested a Mordan administrator. "Billions of individual voices cannot be coordinated into coherent policy." "No," agreed Cross, stepping forward with a grin that was becoming legendary among alien observers. "But they can be coordinated into something better than coherent policy. They can be coordinated into adaptive, responsive, continuously evolving governance that grows stronger with every new voice that joins it." Lieutenant Kane activated a new holographic display showing preliminary models for the proposed Individual Voices Council. The structure was complex beyond anything previously attempted in galactic governance. But it was also beautiful, a dynamic, ever-changing network that could accommodate unlimited diversity while maintaining functional unity. "The human approach to impossible problems," Kane explained to the assembly, "is to stop asking, 'Can this be done?' and start asking, 'How can we make this work?' And the answer to that question is almost always the same: together, with hope and with the willingness to try something that's never been tried before." As the debate continued, Cross found himself thinking about humanity's long journey from an ignored species on the galactic periphery to the catalyst for the most profound transformation in recorded history. They hadn't achieved this through superior technology or military force. They hadn't conquered anyone or imposed their will through threats or intimidation. They had simply shared their stories. Stories about ordinary people facing impossible challenges and finding ways to triumph. Stories about the power of cooperation, the importance of individual growth, and the endless potential for positive change. Stories that carried within them the most powerful force humanity had ever discovered: hope. And hope, it turned out, was indeed infectious. As the Galactic Council of Individual Voices was formally established, the first governing body in cosmic history designed to grow stronger with every new voice that joined it, Cross realized that humanity had accidentally solved the oldest problem in galactic civilization. They had figured out how to build a future that could be better than the past. And for the first time in 800 years of isolation, humanity truly felt like they belonged in the galaxy, not as subjects or conquerors, but as partners in the greatest story ever told, the story of what sapient beings could accomplish when they believed in themselves and each other. 1 year later, Admiral David Cross stood on the observation deck of the Unity, humanity's first diplomatic vessel designed in collaboration with 17 different alien species. Through the transparistile, he could see the newest cultural exchange station, a magnificent construct that housed representatives from over 5,000 worlds. "Admiral," came Lieutenant Kane's voice from behind him. "The latest reports from the Individual Voices Council are coming in." Cross turned to see his former tactical officer, now wearing the insignia of the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, an organization that hadn't existed 2 years earlier. "Good news or bad news?" Kane's smile was answer enough. The Zethkakal Collective has completed its voluntary fragmentation. All 47,000 individual entities have chosen to maintain separate consciousness while contributing to the shared knowledge base. They're calling it collaborative individuality. And the Vordani? 3/4 of the hegemony's military forces have transitioned to what they're calling constructive warfare, using military discipline and strategic thinking to fight poverty, disease, and environmental challenges. Their success rates are unprecedented. Cross nodded, but his attention was drawn to a new arrival at the station, a massive ship unlike anything he had seen before. It bore no markings of any known civilization, and its design seemed to incorporate technological elements from dozens of different species. "What's that vessel?" he asked. Kane's smile widened. "That's the Synthesis, the first ship designed entirely by the Individual Voices Council. It's crewed by volunteers from 302 different species, and its mission is to explore beyond the galactic rim." "Explore for what?" "Other galaxies," Kane replied, matter-of-factly. "Other civilizations. The Council has decided that if human culture could transform our galaxy, there might be other civilizations out there with equally transformative perspectives." Cross felt a familiar mixture of pride and terror. Humanity had helped create a galactic civilization that was no longer content with the status quo, a civilization that was actively seeking new challenges, new growth opportunities, new possibilities for evolution. "Any word from Earth?" he asked. "Dr. Park sends her regards," Kane replied. "The Terran Cultural Development Institute is working on something they're calling empathy engineering. Technology designed to help beings understand and appreciate perspectives completely different from their own." "And President Morrison?" "Still trying to figure out how to govern a species that accidentally became the galaxy's therapist," Kane said with a laugh. "But she says to tell you that the latest poll shows 97% approval for the Terra Integration Protocol." Cross nodded, then turned his attention back to the Synthesis. Somewhere aboard that ship, beings from hundreds of different worlds were working together to push the boundaries of known space, driven by the fundamentally human conviction that there was always something better waiting beyond the horizon. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder what we would have found if we had explored the galaxy 800 years ago?" Kane considered the question seriously. A collection of advanced civilizations that had achieved perfect stability by eliminating growth, diversity, and hope, she replied. "We would have been offered a choice between assimilation and extinction. And now we're part of a galactic civilization that believes growth is infinite, diversity is strength, and hope is a renewable resource," Kane said. "We're part of something that gets stronger with every new voice that joins it." As if summoned by their conversation, a communication signal reached the Unity. The holographic display materialized, showing Zenthira's energy form pulsing with the colors of excitement. "Admiral Cross," Lieutenant Kane, the young Yelnash entity announced. "I wanted you to be the first to know the Synthesis has made contact with something extraordinary." "What kind of contact?" Cross asked. "We've found another galaxy," Zenthira reported, "with over 1 million civilizations that have achieved what they call collaborative transcendence. They've been watching our transformation for the past year, and they want to know if we'd be interested in cultural exchange." Cross and Kane exchanged glances, recognizing the expression on each other's faces, the same mixture of excitement and terror that had defined humanity's journey from ignored species to galactic catalyst. "Tell them," Cross said with a grin, "that we'd love to share some stories." As the communication ended, he turned to look out at the cultural exchange station, where beings from thousands of worlds were working together to build something unprecedented. A civilization based not on conquest or domination, but on the simple conviction that everyone had something valuable to contribute. Humanity had been ignored for 8 centuries, then almost eliminated for being too influential, and finally embraced as partners in the greatest story ever told. But as Cross watched the Synthesis disappear into hyperspace, carrying the galaxy's first ambassadors to another realm of existence entirely, he realized that their story was just beginning. After all, that's what human stories were really about. The understanding that every ending was actually a new beginning, every challenge was an opportunity for growth, and every impossible situation was just another chance to discover what you were truly capable of achieving. And in a universe full of infinite possibilities, that might be the most powerful force of all. In the deepest archives of the Galactic Cultural Repository, The young archivist, part human, part Sathikal, part something entirely new, cataloged the final entry in the Terra integration case files. The statistics were staggering. 47,000 species had joined the Individual Voices Council. Innovation rates had increased by over 3,000% galactic-wide. Violent conflict had decreased by 99.7%. Population satisfaction indices had required the development of entirely new mathematical frameworks. But perhaps most remarkably, the phenomenon that had started with humanity's accidental cultural influence had now spread to 17 other galaxies, each contributing their own unique perspectives to an ever-growing tapestry of collaborative consciousness. The archivist paused at the final document in the file, a simple message that had been transmitted from Earth on the 10th anniversary of first contact. It was signed by every human on the planet, but it contained only 7 words. "Thank you for letting us tell our stories." As the archivist filed the document, they couldn't help but smile at the profound simplicity of it all. Humanity hadn't conquered the galaxy or imposed their will through force. They had simply shared their belief that everyone had a story worth telling, everyone had the potential to grow, and everyone deserved a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. And that belief had transformed not just one galaxy, but an entire universe. In the end, that might be the most human thing of all. The understanding that the greatest victories came not from being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but from being the ones who never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. And in a cosmos full of infinite tomorrows, that was a story worth telling.